Hello, hello. Welcome back to Let's Talk H.P. Lovecraft, doing a bonus edition of H.P. Lovecraft this week for you on a Tuesday. I've been doing about one of these every week for the last month or two, but had a little bit of extra time this week, and I thought I would get ahead of the curve here and talk about Herbert West, Re-Animator. Herbert West, Re-Animator, written 1921 and 22, serialized in several parts in 1922 in the amateur publication Home Brew. The story is divided into 6 sections: From the Dark, The Plague Demon, 6 Shots by Midnight, The Screams of the Dead, The Horror from the Shadows, and The Tomb Legions. These, each section represents 1 month's publication. And being as it is a serialized story, there's a little bit of overlap at the beginning of every section because you need to bring the reader back up to speed. And for that reason, you can just about read these independently of each other and still feel like you've read a complete story. But of course, they are better together. Now, I've read this story twice now. And the first time, I kind of found it to be a little bit annoying with that repetition and that serialized nature of it. But actually, second time around, I found it to be a lot more enjoyable. So let's get into the plot here. The story depicts 17 years, more or less, in the life and experiences of the narrator with a friend, I would say, named Herbert West, the title character. And it leads up to his inevitable disappearance, which is talked about throughout the story. These two people, these 2 young men, are medical students who begin working during their time at Miskatonic University Medical School. And this is, of course, the first time that Miskatonic University in Arkham, fictional university, appears in the work of H.P. Lovecraft. West has made the focus of his study the potential to bring bodies back to life using what he calls liquids or fluids, sort of like a scientific potion, if you will. He begins conducting these experiments on animals in the college labs using college equipment, and he's able to procure specimens through the college legitimately. But soon he wants to move on to using human bodies. And this type of experimentation does not sit well with the college dean, who is also a doctor. The university basically says, yeah, you can't do this. So it puts a damper on his sort of legitimate experimentation and drives him underground. So he and the narrator, they build a secret laboratory on the outskirts of town near a potter's field, which is a cemetery for the poor. And they begin stealing bodies, but it quickly becomes apparent that if your body is not absolutely newly dead, then there's this potential for this quick loss of brain matter, and it becomes difficult to bring back a human as opposed to an empty shell. The first major success of their experimentation happens at that lab, and the body, which they've taken from the cemetery, it's injected with these fluids. There is a scream and sort of this horrible experience, and it sends the 2 of them running out the doors. But meanwhile, a lamp tips over. I think it was a lamp, could have been a Bunsen burner, and it burns the lab down. And shortly after, there's stories about strange disturbances in that cemetery and scratch marks and clawing, and basically the idea that they resurrected some sort of beast of a man, and this beast is out there possibly looking for them. And then they feel that the idea of, eyes in the back of your head, something watching you from behind throughout the rest of the story, but it never really quite materializes. Moving on, a typhoid epidemic grips the town of Arkham, and their skills as medical students who have not yet become official doctors puts their skills at a premium, so they get plenty of access to freshly dead typhoid victims. But one of the victims of the fever is inevitably the dean of the college, who they decide to swipe his body and do their experiments on him. So they shoot him up with the liquids, and he basically turns into a cannibal who goes on a killing spree before he is captured and locked up for the next 17 years in Arkham Asylum. Now, moving on a few years down the road, the two of them are both licensed doctors. They set up a lab near a cemetery in a small sort of mill town, an industrial town called Bolton in New England. And the next experiment is on a young black man who takes part in an illegal boxing match. And they shoot him up with the liquids, and it's much of the same, becomes a... Actually, let me back up a second. It's not quite the same. Actually, I think they failed completely, possibly because he was hit in the head, had a head injury. So they take the body back out and bury it. But the body does inevitably wake up later, comes to their door, is beating on it like a beast, and West empties a complete load in a revolver into him and kills him again. So then... the next time they secure a body, they're still working out of the same lab in Bolton. The narrator has gone on a brief vacation with his family overseas, but he hears from West that, hey, I found a completely fresh body, but I found a new way to maintain its freshness until the experiment can be done. This subject is a traveler from out of town who has died, has no family, so nobody's going to miss him, nobody's going to investigate. When the narrator gets there, the body looks like it's almost alive. West, is running his experiments and doing tests, and he puts a pillow over the thing's head to make sure that he's absolutely dead, apparently. And the narrator finds this to be a little bit strange. What's going on here? So they run the experiment, and sure enough, this was a fresh body. This is a legitimate success. But the man opens his eyes, and he basically says, "Keep that damn needle away from me." So apparently, West has moved on from using dead bodies to actually capturing his victims, his subjects, and killing them. That way they're absolutely fresh when he revives them. And this is very alarming to the narrator, of course. Move on 5 years down the road, and after the success, West has moved on in his interest. And you thought that the idea of reviving the dead was grotesque. Well, you haven't seen anything yet. He moves on from simply reanimating them to actually seeing what he can do with body parts. Can he make body parts live independent of the greater organism? Will that arm stay alive, or that leg, or no matter what body part is missing? So to find a supply of freshly maimed bodies, they both enlist in the army, and they are sent to Flanders to fight to do medical care in World War I. Their commander is a man named Major Sir Eric Moreland Clapman Lee, and he's himself a brilliant doctor. But one day he is nearly decapitated in a plane crash. West gets a hold of the body. He cuts the rest of the head the rest of the way off. Does a skin graft to cover the stump, sticks the body or the head in a vat of his fluids, and then shoots the body up with his liquids. The body starts to move, and they hear a voice. This body has no head. The head in the vat of fluids is doing the talking, and he recalls the last moments before the plane crash. Bail out, bail out. And so it seems that the brain has retained the last thing that it's experienced. After the war, it's another year down the road, They're back in the States. They set up a new lab in Boston near an ancient sort of colonial cemetery with underground catacombs, and they dig their basement into a laboratory down in the sublevels, and they actually open up a hole into the tomb, which they then close up because they have no use for old bodies. Shortly after, a headless Major Eric Moreland, with his head in a box and his head replaced by a wax copy, he shows up. He goes to the asylum. He frees the dean, and he then finds his way to the lab, and with an army of his own undead creations, because he was a brilliant doctor himself, he kills West. The police come to investigate, but the body's been incinerated, and there's no proof. And even if the narrator were to tell him the tale of what West has been doing, who's going to believe that? Who's going to believe that a headless zombie has come to have revenge on Herbert West? And that is your plot, guys. This story is very much like Frankenstein's monster, but more pulpy, than less. I think Frankenstein's a little bit more cerebral, that story. But it's very much Frankenstein for the 20th century. And it's no surprise that this story came from H.P. Lovecraft. I mean, if anyone's going to write the sort of a definitive Frankenstein for a new century, yeah, it would have to be Lovecraft. The transformation of Herbert West from a curious young person experimenting on animals to eventually bodies, to then even killing bodies to undergo or to use for his experiments, sort of reminds me of at least the movie version of the serial killer's journey and how a serial killer progresses. And it's really a warning about how scientific ambition can go too far. You can get lost sort of in your pursuit of knowledge, of succeeding. You sort of lose track of the humanity factor. We've had stories like that in the news here on good old planet Earth, many times in the last decade. Stem cell research comes to mind, and the debate over can you use embryos. Also, more recently, there was the doctor in Korea, I think, or China, who apparently did some gene editing on some unborn embryos, and then actually brought these young people into the world. Aside from that, the concept of reviving people using fluids reminds me very much of the way today that we use adrenaline and epinephrine and other fluids to revive the body. However, what's interesting that is missing here is the idea of using electricity. There was electricity in Frankenstein, I believe. However, it's missing here. But of course, today, it's nothing to defibrillate somebody. Like, we have pocket-sized defibrillators now. I know the defibrillator didn't really come about until probably the 50s, sort of Korean War era. So it basically didn't exist yet in Lovecraft's time, but I'm sure we were probably experimenting and knew the basics of humans and electric currents and things like that. But it is interesting that he went with this sort of fluid concept. The fluid concept does have a corollary with adrenaline and things like that in our age, but it also speaks to me in a different way, which is fluid being sort of like potions. So it's almost has a sense of magic to it, aside from science. West was very much concerned with science, whereas the narrator was more, he was a scientist, but he also had thoughts about the soul and about what it meant to, what did the body see beyond the grave. So it's interesting how in this story, and I think this is sort of the theme to drive home, the interesting of this juxtaposition of science and religion, science and faith, and the fact that while many people tend to be like absolutely one way or the other. The lines are kind of blurry. We do know that when people have been revived after, minutes being clinically dead on a table, they have had interesting experiences, and it's changed their lives in interesting ways. So in many ways, I think Lovecraft was very much ahead of his time in sort of exploring these concepts. And yeah, guys, that is Herbert West, Re-Animator, one of Lovecraft's, I would say, probably his most popular stories. It's been adapted into a movie and into many other formats, and I think it's ripe for another reimagining. I have a hunch that Lovecraft, who has gained in notoriety in recent years and recent decades, I have a hunch that we're going to see finally probably some big budget, high quality Lovecraft film adaptations. And I think this will be a good one to go with. Guillermo del Toro has his long conceived At the Mountains of Madness project, but this actually might be something more up his alley than that, and I actually would love to see a Guillermo del Toro adaptation of Herbert West. So thanks for tuning in, guys. If you're still listening, thank you. Please subscribe to my channel, and until next time, keep it creepy.